This is the room where I do most of my work, writing about art. When I'm working, I'm thinking in words, but the artists I write about think in pictures. Over there on the wall, there's a vast composite drawing by the artist John Virtue. I think of it as a map of his mind, or perhaps it's more like a labyrinth, one I often find myself drawn into, trying to find my way through it. I think the same can be said of any drawing really worth its salt. It puts us into direct contact with the conscious mind, and sometimes, even more disconcertingly, with the unconscious one. That's one of the great strengths of drawing, the way in which it makes us think about what the artist is thinking. It's a medium that speaks more freshly and directly and immediately than any other about the mystery of what goes on in here. If you want to get up close and personal with some of the world's greatest artists, this is the place to start. The British Museum's Department of Prints and Drawings. It's not just a repository of art, it's a wonderful museum of the creative mind. Over 500 years of artistic inspiration you can study at thrillingly close range. Looking at a finished painting or a monumental sculpture can be like listening to an artist lecture, the full public performance. But looking at drawing is like talking to them or reading their diary. Drawing is inherently intimate, it's where genius is off duty. And because of that, it's where artists really dwell on what they love, revealing themselves in the process. So behind the delicate wispy shades of this great Botticelli drawing of a woman clothed in clinging transparent veils, you can see his immensely erotic imagination in its raw and naked state. There's a distinctly more practical and ordered part of the mind at work in this picture, an intricate design for a fountain made around 1500 by the great German artist Albrecht Dürer. Or is there? It's more than simply a sketch for a luxury object. Look at the delicacy of the watercolour, the filigrees and fancy adornments. That's Dürer to a T. He was foppish, flamboyant, always beautifully dressed. This drawing is a wonderful example of his flourish, the artist-magician who plucks beautiful objects out of thin air. But turn to a different artistic sensibility altogether, the mind that sees the world as a far darker place. And what kind of drawing emerges if that mind is beginning to unravel? This brilliant but strange composition by Britain's greatest satirist, James Gillray, absolutely captures that. Gillray's genius, his quivering, nervous line, and ability to transform his subject into something at once real and yet sarcastic and distorted, leaps off this surface. The marks put us at the heart of a kind of wandering psychosis. It's a drawing of a man called George Humphrey, who was the nephew of Gillray's landlady. And it's interesting that the person whom it was made of has actually felt driven to write on it. This portrait of George Humphrey Jr. was drawn by James Gillray on the 1st of July 1811, he being at that time insane. One of the things I love most about great drawings is the way in which each one seems to transport you to a different chamber of the human mind. In recent times, artists have self-consciously adopted styles suggesting madness. This frenetic barroom scene by the German expressionist George Grosz whirls you to the heart of Berlin in the 20s. A culture gone mad, a society collectively deranged by its own decadence. Its frenzied line suggests that Grosz might well have thrown himself into the indulgences it depicts. This collection has more than 50,000 drawings. These few examples are enough to demonstrate that pretty much all of human emotion is here. Desire, fear, self-loathing, even self-transcendence. The American minimalist Sol LeWitt created this according to a formula of mind-numbing repetitiveness, using a ruler to cover the paper with a dense mathematical sequence of the thinnest yellow lines. The result's surprisingly beautiful. I think of him like a Buddhist monk, singing the same repetitive mantra in the hope that enlightenment will suddenly strike. From banal gesture emerges a mist of colour, an eccentric attempt to picture infinity. Drawing is an inherently instinctive activity. In fact, you could argue that it's one of the first ways we make sense of the world. Look at how easily drawing comes to children. Every child will be found scribbling away by the time they're just 2 years old. And by the age of 3 or 4, they can work out shape and colour. And since drawing is a way of defining who we are, it's hardly surprising that the human figure is almost always the first realistic pictorial drawing a child does. The child's feel for line is, like their mind, intuitive and playful. Even though by age 5 or 6 their pages are often telling stories, they're still intriguing and abstract. And then something happens. We grow up, and the ability to draw carefree and uninhibited disappears. Can we ever get it back again? This is one of the high temples of the classical drawing tradition, a life class in the Ruskin School at Oxford University. Many different students making many different studies of the same model. Few art schools nowadays concentrate on drawing from the model, perhaps seeing it as an old-fashioned academic exercise, like mastering a mathematical equation. Not so for the professor here, Sarah Simblett. Inspiring her pupils to master the human form isn't about scholarly precision, but about freeing the mind from inhibition, harnessing the childlike, expressive instinct.
There's a fundamental drive in us all to want to make a mark, and it's a very important means of, language of communication, and people will draw for many different reasons. And those who come to my classes will have an enormous range of motivations for wanting to draw. And then it's important to me that if there are 20 people in the room, that every single one of them is doing something different and doing what they want to do. Although I teach life classes, I often forget that it is a life class. There is the model, there is the subject, but the people who are actually coming to the class are coming because they want to learn how to draw, and it doesn't matter what the subject is, it doesn't matter that it's a life model. And so I will have a great range of activities going on within the room. So that with each fresh, quick drawing, you're learning a little bit more about this particular pose, okay? You want to think about capturing just the most essential lines that describe her gesture, her stance, the distribution of weight on one leg or another. Make sure that you're placing the load-bearing foot. I would encourage each individual to draw in a way that is natural to themselves. But in the end, the expressive content of the work's got to come from them. So I'll help them with the technicalities, but the actual drawing and their purpose in making it has got to come from themselves.
An artist in her own right, Simblett's drawings straddle various styles, from anatomically precise to large-scale fantastical compositions. What they all share is a visualization of her sensibility, the expression of different aspects of the mind through line. Well, I've noticed that there's a kind of split in your work between this very fine filigree drawing of what you see, whether it's plants or skulls, and then there are these other things, well, particularly up here, where if I didn't know, I'd say that they were by a completely different artist. What are these drawings?
These drawings are made Intuitively drawing from my subconscious. They're made in a few seconds in response to a powerful emotion about something. And they're made without knowing what the image will be, but letting the momentum of the feeling or idea flow onto the paper through the brush. So they're made very, very quickly.
So that's the drawing of the brain, and that's the drawing that comes out of the brain.
Brain in action, yes. With these, I suppose it's a process of looking, seeing, thinking, understanding, gaining knowledge of something that exists in the world. With these, it's really drawing an emotion.
Do you feel like you're pulling it out of yourself? I mean,
yes, in a way. It's like a sort of outward breath.
Sarah's art reminds me of her approach to teaching, her belief that there should be room both for control and spontaneity. And that's exemplified above all in the life class. Since the subjects are given, something the artists simply have to observe and study, they become all the more free to discover their own personal angle on the world, as artists have always done. Life drawing's as old as the tradition of illusionistic art, which is where Western art really begins. The tradition of trying to create figures that look like real live human beings, as the mythical Pygmalion did when he created a statue so lifelike that she actually walked off her plinth. The ancient Greeks certainly studied from the live model when they created the muscular figures that animate the Parthenon frieze, and Renaissance art's full of it. There are drawings by Raphael where you can still see how this saint or that crucified Christ began life in a scene just like this one, a model posed before the artist. Life drawing has been fundamental to Western art, part of its DNA. But equally fundamental is a continuing argument about which part of the human mind the artist should call on when drawing, how much of the inner self should be allowed in, and how much held back. For Renaissance artists, drawing was a crucial tool of the rational intellect, the very basis of the works by which we remember them, great paintings and frescoes, often worked on by assistants as much as the artists themselves. But this vast composition, 8 metres long and 2 metres high, is without doubt the work of just one hand, that of Raphael, the great Renaissance master of harmony, balance and composition. Raphael's often been described as the single greatest draftsman in the entire tradition of Western art, and this is his greatest and most ambitious drawing. So you could say that, logically speaking, it's the #1 drawing in the whole world. In its own time, it was brilliantly original as well as technically extraordinary. Raphael had been commissioned to paint a number of great frescoes for Pope Julius's library, and he was thinking about the idea of libraries, pantheons of the great learned men of the past. Raphael's big idea was to actually bring the great thinkers of the past into, so to speak, one space and have them interacting with each other. So at the center of his picture of the progress of human learning, you see Plato and Aristotle conversing with one another, Plato pointing up to the sky, for him the source of true intellectual enlightenment, Aristotle pointing to the earth to indicate his preference for empirical knowledge. And all around them, the great thinkers of antiquity are engaged in debate. Down here on the left, you've got Pythagoras demonstrating a theorem, while some people behind him seem to be actually pinching his ideas. It's a work of art about ideas, about the intellect, and as a work of art, it absolutely embodies this idealized intellectual view of what art is that Raphael had. If you look at it very closely, you'll see that every little detail of that drawing has been pricked through so that it can be transferred perfectly onto the frescoed surface of the final work. His technique is designed to ensure that the drawing, which is his idea, his brain, his mind in action, that the drawing is perfectly preserved in the finished work. Raphael did more than any other Renaissance figure to put drawing at the very centre of the Western art tradition. The art academies that sprang up in his wake, first in Italy, then across Europe, placed the ability to draw at the heart of their teaching curricula. Drawing was seen as the key skill in learning how to conjure a convincing illusion of form and space. But it was also valued as the medium that most accurately reflected man's highest faculty, his sacred, God-given ability to reason. It was a visual translation of our rational minds, the ordering of consciousness. But look elsewhere in the art of the Renaissance and scratch beneath the surface, and we can see that even then there was another side to drawing, a side that reflected not the ordering mind, but a very different, more instinctual part of us. To get a rare glimpse of it, you have to go back to the very origins of the Renaissance and a series of vivid 14th century images that might never have surfaced had it not been for a 20th century act of war. In July 1944, American artillery dropped a firebomb in the heart of Pisa. It just missed the famous Leaning Tower, landing instead on the chapel of the Campo Santo. The lead roof melted, dripped down the walls, and damaged the frescoes inside, which is how they now come to hang in this antechamber, in their peeling, perilous state. This would be a scandalous episode in the history of art, were it not for the unexpected byproduct of this gung-ho Yankee attack. As the plaster from the frescoes came away, it revealed exuberantly detailed underdrawings, or synopie as they're known. The drawings were made by the artist Francesco da Traiano, assuming that they'd never be seen again. And maybe because he thought they'd stay a secret, he really let his imagination run riot. The subject of this particular underdrawing is the Last Judgment, and it's a particularly vengeful scene of Last Judgment in which 3/4 of the whole picture is given over to hell. It's probably no coincidence that this work was created during the same decade as the Black Death, and you can sense the pious terror that was rippling through society at the time. In fact, you can sense it, interestingly, much more vividly in the underdrawing than you can in the fresco itself, because the underdrawing is full of this much more vividly captured sense of emotion. These figures who are utterly terrified as they're being dragged back into hell by these demons armed with hooks. There's the archangel dragging this reluctant, pitiful woman towards hell. And yet, when you compare that figure with what happened in the actual fresco, where these figures were replaced by an angel dragging a rather inert monk towards the flames of hell, it's lost all of its vigor, all of its energy. Something happens when the medieval artist draws. You see it in manuscript illumination, in the babooneries and grotesqueries that you find around the margins. And I think you find it absolutely here, in an image not at the margin, but underneath. It's like the id of medieval art. And it seethes with this kind of energy and imagination. The synopie and the frescoes seem to express quite different aspects of creativity. One liberated, the other far more contained. And looking at them got me thinking about the relationship between different parts of the mind, and about what actually happens in the consciousness when we set out to draw the things we see or imagine. So, perhaps foolishly, I agreed to take part in a kind of experiment. John Chelenko is the head of drawing and cognition at Camberwell Art School in London. For over 10 years now, he's been working with this scary Clockwork Orange-style contraption, the eye tracker, a device that measures with precise millisecond accuracy the movements of my eyes as I try in vain to draw the man with possibly the world's bushiest eyebrows. do you shade? I blame the tools. Drawing isn't something I do. It's not really part of my life. So trying to render a real person's face into an accurate two-dimensional drawing was more than a challenge. And what's the aim of your research? Is there a particular holy grail that you're looking for?
It's really a combination of two things. One is that I'm very curious as to the details of how drawing is produced, how it happens, and that's the eye and the hand, and the combination of the two with the brain in between. Just a detailed observation of the making of art, really. And narrowing down on this instant of creativity, which I think is absolutely fantastic, so that you can actually pinpoint that within a fraction of a second. That's where the line was made, you see, and that's the result of it.
To enable Chilenko to explain to me how my naive and untrained eye compares with that of a skilled artist, I asked Ruskin College professor Sarah Simblett to come and tackle the same subject. From the outset, it was striking how effortless she seemed to find the process of translating life onto the page, the same process that I'd found so frustrating. When I was doing it, I felt an immense struggle to translate what my eye could see. I could see that what my eye could see was very complicated, and I was thinking about the complexity of it, but I didn't have in my body a kind of set. I felt the absence of a set of codes, if you like, or a set of practices. So I was really I almost felt frozen half the time.
I think in a way, what was the element that is missing with you and which is present with Sarah is that when she draws the nose, the line doesn't exist. There is no line on the nose. You have to decide what the line is going to be. Is it going to be the light and shade, the change in color? Is it what you want to do? All that has to come into a decision. But Sarah's been doing that decision all the time, so she, that's no problem. Whereas a beginner will look at the nose and says, well, what am I going to do with this now? And usually there's, at that stage, a cop-out where you say, well, I'll just look very hard at it and hope that art flows through my hand. In fact, it's a very specific task. Decide what line you want. Pick it up visually, as we saw. Vision is selective anyway. Decide what you want to do with it and draw it down. That's what the brain is doing for getting from one to the other.
Chilenko has developed a complex system to analyse how the mind gathers information to produce a drawing. Feeding the video of the eye tracker into a computer, he produces a map of looks. These red lines show the number of times my eye went back and forth from the model to the page, as well as where I fixed my gaze, my focus throughout. A trained artist's eye travels to the subject with a constant sense of purpose, generating a mass of information-gathering looks, like so many bees gathering pollen. My look was more like a drunk going home from the pub. My eye was all over the place, as I struggled simultaneously to pick up the details of the face and remember them as I moved back to the drawing board. As I fumbled my way through, I became very conscious of different parts of myself being drawn upon in the act of trying to draw. And then, near the end, when I gave up trying to accurately capture the model and simply make a picture of a man's head, a sort of childlike instinct kicked in. I stopped making lines and started pushing the charcoal around with my fingers, trying to feel form and light and shade, rather than think it. And I had the impression, illusion maybe, of beginning to get somewhere. Perhaps this duality between instinct and intellect, to put it crudely, is as old as the human desire to create images. Travel right back in time, and by the perspective of the world's oldest art, the period we think of as art history, pretty much from antiquity to today, is comparatively small, just 2,500 years or so. It's only been in the last century that we've really come to appreciate just how ancient our primal impulse to capture the living world really is. When cave art was first discovered in the late 19th century, it shook up the whole canon of art history. This newly revealed prehistoric art was so old, there was no criterion by which to judge it. Primitive as its aesthetic was, it turned out to be some of the freshest, most vibrant imagery ever seen.
These are animals. For example, this is a horse. It's a horse, very beautiful.
Yeah.
This is the head.
These relatively rudimentary sketches were inscribed 30,000 years ago on the walls of Las Monedas cave in Cantabria, northern Spain. They're the earliest evidence we have of the mind making faithful representations of the world. Their discovery was a breakthrough, not just in the history of art, but in the history of human evolution. These works were stunningly more sophisticated than arrowheads bashed from flint or other everyday objects made by primitive man. Pigments had been mixed, charcoal used to outline shapes. And there's composition too, composition at its most overwhelming in this vast panorama of the celebrated Paleolithic site at Altamira, where, quite literally, the hand of the artist is everywhere in evidence. The caves at Altamira were first discovered in 1879 by a local landowner. Up until that time, archaeologists and historians had believed that Paleolithic peoples were essentially primitive warriors whose consciousness was based purely on instinct. But the discovery of these extraordinary images, including some 30 large figures of bison and other wild animals in what's known as the polychrome chamber, suggested something far more sophisticated. But not straight away. Great antiquity of this period and on this scale had never been experienced before. Many scholars thought it was a fraud, and one even went so far as to suggest that the whole thing, this Sistine Chapel of cave art, had been faked up by fanatical Spanish clerics in an attempt to discredit Darwin's theories of evolution. The panorama of animals on the polychrome chamber is thought to be the work of just one artist. Why he or she made it, we'll never know. A backdrop to shamanistic ritual, or some elaborate game of courtship. Even their very revelations about primitive man's mindset and the sophistication of his brain continue to spark debate.
Since they were first discovered, what's blown people's minds about these cave paintings was that something so sophisticated, so extraordinary, could have emerged out of the culture of cavemen 30, 40,000 years ago. What I've challenged is that idea at its base. What I think these cave paintings possibly show is the absolute opposite, is that here we're dealing with painters, artists, who actually had much more primitive minds, pre-modern minds. They may not even have had language. And the reason for saying that is because I see a remarkable resemblance between those cave paintings and the drawings of contemporary children who are in many ways backward. The most remarkable of them probably is a little girl called Nadia, a daughter of a Ukrainian family who'd come to England in the 1960s. She was severely autistic. She had only perhaps a dozen words of language. She was clumsy and unable to communicate. But she, from the age of 3 or so, would take up a paintbrush or a pencil and start drawing at the level of a young Picasso. This is a girl who seemed to have no motivation for wanting to draw or to communicate. She was just obsessed with the activity of somehow putting what she saw onto paper, and once she'd done it, she'd push it away or draw over the top of it. Now, if a girl in that condition can produce drawings of the same quality as the drawings which we admire so much on the caves of Altamira, then the question is wide open. Did these cave painters have what we always imagine they have? Did they have modern minds? Were they into symbolism and so on? Or were they perhaps, in many ways, different from us?
The problem with pinning down cave art is there's no frame of reference to place these first acts of drawing. Personally, I believe they do represent some kind of structuring intelligence, seeking to give form to certain beliefs. Although I suppose it's possible they might simply reflect a basic human drive. Until someone invents a time machine, they'll remain a wondrous enigma. The relationship between the conscious and instinctive mind is easier to trace when we re-enter the charted waters of art history. In fact, for the last 100 years or so, it's been one of the principal concerns of the modern artist. So though this looks like it could be a drawing by Nadia or a cave painter, it is in fact that of a truly modern mind, Pablo Picasso, sketching in real time, straight from his brain to the page. The similarity isn't a coincidence. When Picasso saw cave art for himself, it had a profound effect. He dismissed academic art as decadent and felt we all had to get back to the very roots of image making. And that's why Picasso experimented with drawing throughout his life. Je suis le cahier, he famously said. I am the sketchbook. As the prime inventor of what we think of as modern art, his drawings contain a great lesson, revealing the vast chasm between old master and modern drawing. Old master drawing showed, if you like, the conscious, rational mind at the peak of its powers, the mind that grasps reality, how light and shade works, how the body and the muscles work, and retransmits that infinitude of subtle observations into images that reflect the visible world. Modern drawing, by contrast, seems to represent the triumph of the irrational mind. So many modern drawings seem to aspire to the expression of the id, to the expression of order breaking down or mental strangeness. Many modern drawings even look like the drawings of children. Children, that is, before they've acquired the inhibitions of self-conscious thought. And Picasso lived right on the cusp between these two traditions, the old and the new. He's the absolute turning point of drawing, moving from the conscious mind to the unconscious one. In his youth, he was an academic draftsman par excellence, but as he matured, he rejected that. Indeed, he once said, "When I was young, I could draw like Raphael, but it's taken me all my life to learn, once more, how to draw like a 5-year-old child."
It's terribly difficult to undo the ways we've learned to look at the world. A child of 5 or 6 was once famously said, when he was asked how he made his drawings, he said, "Well, first I have a think, and then I draw my think." And that's exactly the problem. The training of an artist is in many ways the training to overcome growing up, overcome the development of your mind, which makes this sort of way of looking at the world so difficult.
In Picasso's wake, many 20th century avant-garde artists became obsessed with getting back to drawing's spontaneous, childlike scribbling, freed from adult inhibition. None more so than the perpetually bonkers surrealists. In the 1930s, they even came up with a formula that would assist an artist in drawing his think. The rules were simple. A, entry into a state similar to a trance. B, abandonment to interior tumult. C, rapidity of writing. No, it's not the template for writing a blockbuster novel. This was the artist André Masson's formula for surrealist art. Art that went directly from the unconscious mind onto the page. The idea of the game was to produce so-called automatic drawings, part of the Surrealist Manifesto. Doodle and be enlightened. Draw and find elements of your repressed self in the free-flowing realm of calligraphy. These are some of Masson's drawings, made largely throughout the 1930s and 40s. They look, at first glance, as if spiders with ink on their legs have walked all over the pages. Closer inspection shows that these linear flicks and swirls make up odd landscapes, cascades, and orgies. Mostly orgies, in fact, for even the landscapes have a phallic or gynecological aspect to them. There's a freedom to his lines, darting across the page in all manner of directions, the eye darting with them. But stop to think carefully about this, draftsman's spaghetti and ask yourself, just how automatic is it?
Free expression is not really ever free. We can be sure of that. You can loosen the reins a bit, but it's always going to reveal the kind of ruts and furrows which our minds follow because of history, just because of the way minds work. So it's not free. It would be totally uninteresting if it was completely free. What's most obvious about those is that they are clearly representations of what people thought their subconscious ought to be up to, heavily influenced by Freud.
Here's Masson himself. Like almost all of the other notable surrealists, he was a man and a Catholic. There was a lot of repressed sexuality going on in their project. Liberating their psyches often involved a very unliberating kind of male sexual fantasy. Free your mind, and an ass will follow. Masson's mistake was to be shackled to his id, or at least to a preconceived Freudian idea of what the unconscious might be, a dark place in the brain, seething with sexual fantasy. He couldn't quite escape the fact that drawing really does reveal the most intimate corners of the mind, you might say, of a dirty old man. It's been a long time since the heyday of surrealism, but I'm curious to know why so much current drawing has a surrealist feel to it. Are contemporary artists still trying to connect with the unconscious? I wanted to get it from the horse's mouth, so I went to meet one of the art world's brightest young masters of weirdness, David Shrigley. Do you believe in the old surrealist idea that somehow drawing is a line connecting your subconscious through your hand to the page, and that if you just draw, your subconscious will miraculously appear?
Yeah.
You believe it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think I believe in remote viewing and the delta waves and all. I don't take any LSD or anything like that, but I think I feel that I'm in touch with the human collective consciousness at the time when I'm drawing. It does depend on my...
Are you winding me up?
No. It does depend a little bit on my caffeine intake and the time of day. However, I feel that I'm sometimes experiencing something slightly mystical at the time when I'm really in the zone and I'm making good things. I feel that I'm in touch with the very soul of, stuff.
Why don't I believe you?
Well, you're an art critic, you're cynical by nature, but it's, I suppose if you say these things, it's hard to say things as stupid as that without implying some humour. But there is an element of that surrealist thing.
Have you ever found yourself drawing something without realising that you were drawing it?
Oh yeah, well, when you're on the phone to people, you always end up doing these drawings which are a bit like, I suppose they're a bit like the surreal, they're a bit like Henri Michaud or something, where you're on the phone to somebody who you hate, and you're just like, okay, yeah, and you're drawing pictures of like owls. You think, why did I draw an owl? I don't know.
What I really like about Shrigley's drawings is the way they capture random, unexpected thoughts. But where most of us dismiss and forget those thoughts, Shrigley holds on, stops something slight from passing, and makes it into something that's both recognisable and otherworldly. I don't think he really taps into his unconscious. He's more Monty Python than Sigmund Freud, for my money. But he certainly pulls all kinds of fascinating flotsam and jetsam from the stream of consciousness. There's something unchained, even an element of the automatic, in all that he does.
I've got to keep moving, I've got to keep drawing. I suppose the drawing is a representation of what I'm thinking. The things that I like the most that I've made are the things that surprise me, that come from some other place, where I can't really retrace that train of thought to how I got to that place.
Having met Shrigley, I wonder if a trained artist can ever truly sabotage conscious thought and create drawings that plumb the deepest recesses of the mind. The most extreme attempt I can think of to uncover this holy grail of the would-be instinctive draftsman was a series of positively loopy pseudo-scientific experiments which used hard drugs, but took place here at London's Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital in the 1930s. Stored away in an air-controlled chamber is a series of drawings made at that time under the influence of the powerful psychedelic drug, mescaline. In those days, it was perfectly acceptable to give seriously mind-bending substances to vulnerable people, so two psychiatrists, Maclay and Gutman, used mescaline to investigate the disorientating, hallucinatory side effects of the mental illness depersonalization. After experimenting with actual patients coherent enough to describe their visions, they hit on the idea of doing the same with artists who could make direct and accurate pictures of out-of-body experiences. One of them was in fact a surrealist, an English one, Julian Trevelyan. When questioned about these drawings, he claimed he couldn't recall the line touching the surface of the paper, but rather it had floated in space like a wire. Trevelyan described the experience of taking mescaline in his autobiography, Indigo Days. "To me it is above all," he said, "the hyper-awareness of the beauty of things. To a painter, a rubbish dump is potentially as beautiful as the Garden of Eden. I have, under mescaline, fallen in love with a sausage roll and with a crumpled piece of newspaper out of the pig bucket." Maclay and Gutman's experiments ended pretty much as soon as they'd begun, perhaps because they realised that drawings made on drugs are like conversations with people who are stoned. The lines of communication are all mixed up. It's a bit like listening to a radio that's out of tune. But there's always been a deep connection between drawing and the mentally disturbed patients of Bethlehem, or Bedlam as it was once known. This collection is full of work which really does seem to open a door onto all kinds of distinctly uncontrolled forms of consciousness, drawings that really lay the mind bare and make visible states of mind that many of us can only guess at. Among the most well-known are those of Louis Wain, famous as the man who drew cats. Frightening, frazzled cats in these examples, made during his last years at Bethlehem, when he was suffering from schizophrenia. But the work I find most painful here is the large collection of drawings by Cynthia Pell. A trained artist, Pell had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for around 10 years, before being fully committed in 1973. For the rest of her life, she would vividly reveal her mental condition on these frequently stark, bleak pieces of paper.
She was a hugely interesting and unhappy person who seemed to find confirmation for her existence in drawing, and it seemed to be really quite necessary for her. She drew all the time. She drew on anything, little pieces of paper, envelopes, scraps of card, anything at all she could find. Drawing seemed absolutely necessary to her. It was kind of like breathing. It was part of her. It was innate. She became very depressed and didn't draw during the last year of her life. She was on the locked ward, and I used to visit her. And then she did start drawing again, but her work became a lot darker. She'd started shaving her head, and it looked rather as if she'd come from a concentration camp or something during particularly the last year. And a lot of her images were quite skeletal, quite dark, and hugely melancholy.
There's an ages-old tradition that links art to madness, that sees art as a window onto the disordered mind. It goes all the way back to Plato, who thought artists were too dangerous and irresponsible to be allowed into his ideal republic. And it resurfaced again in the Renaissance view of the artist as a melancholic, born under the sign of Saturn, his creativity inextricably linked to depression and a habit of morbid introversion. It was most brilliantly expressed by Dürer in his famous print, Melancholia. And the idea persisted into the Romantic period, when Goya drew his famous "The sleep of reason produces monsters," seeing the artist's feverish imaginings as the dreams that come when we suspend or lose control. There's no smoke without fire, and I do think there's some truth in it. The great artists, from Caravaggio to Van Gogh and beyond, have always been in touch with aspects of thought and feeling that other people tend to suppress or ignore. But ultimately, I find it truly disturbing to look at the drawings of those who are, purely and simply, suffering from mental illness. They're beautiful and intriguing, but in the end, how therapeutic are they? Cynthia Pell committed suicide not long after finishing this picture. She cut her throat, in the bath. Which prompts the question, what can be gained from drawing as a therapeutic activity? One place that goes some way to answering that is in San Francisco, an art centre come gallery that's given hundreds of people a unique opportunity to communicate with the world around them. It's called Creative Growth and is one of the world's biggest centres for art made by the developmentally disabled, people living with autism, cerebral palsy, motor neurone conditions. Since it opened in 1975, it's been home to almost 1,000 different artists, whose works have been collected by museums, as well as Hollywood actors, Bill Clinton, and even our own royal family. The work made at Creative Growth is usually referred to as outsider art. These artists have usually had no formal training whatsoever. They're just immersed in the act of creating, the intuitive process of making their mark, day after day.
The fundamental action of putting pen on paper and making that mark, that early graffiti, is very important. It happens for all artists, but I think that for people who might not be able to speak or who might communicate in other ways, it's even more fundamentally important to have a way to visually represent their thoughts or what they're thinking. Someone like Dan Miller isn't verbally articulate, although he uses words and he can spell some words. Dan uses a series of words in his drawings that often repeat, words like on, off, click, light bulb, electricity. And I think looking at his work, he's revealing to us the way he thinks about things, the way his mind works or doesn't work, the way the synapses connect, the way ideas come on and off in his head. And I think the process of writing these words and having them turn into these large drawings is actually a kind of evidence of his thought process.
To see just how closely drawing mirrors personality, take the example of William and Richard Tyler. Autistic since birth, they've been coming here for almost 30 years. And though they're identical twins, their drawings couldn't be more different.
Their work has been different right from the start. William Tyler is fantastically precise and an incredible drawer, very verbal and more socially interactive. Richard's work is not. It's abstract, it's usually non-figurative, it's colorful, and Richard is largely non-verbal and withdrawn. So even though these two brothers are identical twins, their work is quite different. And I think that also speaks to the way that artistic communication is really inherently different for each person. In William Tyler's work, you clearly see that his autism is at play and influencing the way that he draws. The idea of precision, of repetition, his fear of social situations are often reflected thematically, his obsession with clocks and times and dates. Those are all a part of the way his brain functions and the way his thought process is influenced by his autism. For me, the term outsider art means that art doesn't respond to the history of art. You can't look to the person's training. You can't ask them for the theory behind it. You can't ask them for the conceptual meaning of the work. There it is. It's an immediate primal response. In some ways, this is modern cave painting. You know, here it is. These are these marks on the wall that we discover. What do they mean to us? Are they ritualistic? Are they communication? Is it language? Are they words? Is it mark making? Is it an obsessive compulsive repetition of something that the person is trying to tell us? In many ways, it's all of those things, I think.
What's fascinating about the work here is that it so clearly shows the mind, however remote, drawn out on the page. These drawings do seem to represent the sheer instinctual joy of mark-making, taking drawing back to where we started, to its pure childlike state. Creative growth's artists may well be outside of art history, but in their frenzied repetition and optical oddness, they mirror the surrealist idea of automatic drawing, and Picasso casting aside his academic draftsmanship. This is about as free as drawing can ever get. And so to our final stop. Not sunny California, but London's East End, where so many of today's young artists live and work. Making art from photography, video, performance. Any old medium, in fact, but rarely pencil and paper. One artist who seems to epitomise the current trends in art is Michael Landy. Like many of his peers, he's best known for sculpture and installations. He made headline news all over the world in 2001 with this show called Breakdown. The title was both metaphoric and literal. Over the course of 2 weeks, Landy destroyed every single thing he possessed. His car, his record collection, his passport, even his own sculptures. Left with nothing but the boiler suit he was wearing, he went back to his flat and started making art again. But not like a conceptual artist, more like a Renaissance one. I remember after you'd done Breakdown, I came to see you and we had a drink or something, and you said that you were working on some drawings of weeds that grow out of the pavements. Why did you draw weeds?
I guess because they're kind of forlorn things, but also very optimistic things that I mean, in an urban context, that they just grow in little cracks in the street, and they can flourish without very much nourishment or water or soil, and they'll just disperse their seeds, and then you'll find lots of them growing. Because I tried to grow them in pots and try and pamper them, but they'd always end up dying on me, but then the seeds would fly away and they would end up in the tarmac and they'd grow happily in the tarmac. So I sort of saw them as kind of very optimistic kind of signs, really.
And you yourself were sort of, I suppose, a kind of urban weed at that point, that you had no substructure whatsoever because you just destroyed all your own possessions.
Yeah, so, yeah, I'd obviously, after Breakdown, I'd obviously set myself, like, you know, I mean, I destroyed all my own artworks and things, so suddenly it's like I negated everything, and it was very difficult to start again, actually.
It strikes me that Landy himself was surprised by how intimately connected he felt with the process of drawing, so much so that it was at the heart of his next project. Called Semi-Detached, this consisted of a full-scale replica of his parents' home, identical down to the smallest detail, installed at Tate Britain. Alongside the house, Landy projected a video depicting the day-to-day domestic life of his father, John Landy, a former tunnel miner, largely housebound since an industrial accident in the 1970s. The piece was a tribute to his father, and, perhaps because of that, it was the catalyst for Landy's most emotionally charged drawings to date.
I kind of thought about why I felt most passionate about it, and that was kind of the plight of my dad. It's when I went to visit my parents and I kind of left and feeling kind of frustrated that I was unable to, like, I'm a visual artist, and I should be able to kind of deal with it. I felt I should be able to deal with this kind of emotive family matter, and being unable to, in a way. And that's gone on for years. and I wanted to do a project about my dad, and so it was a kind of natural thing for me to do, would be just to spend some time with him and draw him. He let me draw, because he'd recently had his leg operated on, and he let me draw his scar, which was nice, because I was carrying my own scar at that time, so that was quite poignant in a way, that it was just been stapled up together.
The one of the hand particularly seems very much to constitute, the skin seems almost transparent, like you can see through to what's underneath.
Yeah.
Was that what you could actually see, or was that what you were feeling?
Well, it's kind of what I can see, but it's also my dad's hand, because he had an industrial accident in the late 70s, then his hand is more like a kind of clamp in a way, so like he's holding a cigarette, so I wanted to get over that kind of feeling, really.
Do you feel that by going back, by starting again with drawing, you're starting again with the sort of the basic element of art, you know?
Yeah.
Thought, paper, hand.
Yeah. I don't know if it's even thought really. It's some kind of, I kind of meditate almost when I draw. You kind of cut out everything else, and it is a very simple kind of thing about to try and render something to my best of my ability. I did life drawing between 16 and 18 on my foundation course, and I got to 18 and I could draw the human body without looking at my paper. And then after that, I didn't know what to do with it after that, so I stopped, which is a shame actually. I wish I'd kept it on. And then 20 years later, then I'm drawing my dad. I've had like intensive periods of drawing, and then I've had years of no draftsmanship at all.
If one thing's become clear to me while travelling through these interviews and studio visits, therapy sessions, cave divings and trips to Bedlam, it's that the drawings that move me the most are those where the conscious shaping mind and the instinctual, imaginative mind seem to be working together in some moving, not entirely explicable way. And I think that's what I find so touching about Michael Landy's drawings, especially his powerful drawings of London weeds, done when he was in a state of crisis, trying to recover from an almost total breakdown of himself. They're beautiful drawings, beautifully precise, academic almost in the sense that they would have made perfect sense to a Raphael or a Dürer. But there's also a deep instinctual quality about them. They carry a strong emotional charge and deliver a basic, defiant human message. I think they were Michael's way of saying that no matter what happens, I intend to survive, just like these weeds growing through cracks in the pavement in the least hospitable of human environments. The same message applies to drawing itself as a medium. It might have been pronounced dead in the conceptualist ghetto of one or two modish art schools, but it isn't dead at all. It's far too important a part of ourselves, of our minds, to die or disappear. Like Michael Landy's weeds, drawing will always survive.
Well, if you're inspired by the series, find out more at bbc.co.uk/secretive drawing. Next here tonight, a drama guaranteed to make you squeamish. And if you can't face that, switch to BBC4 for a programme about saucy seaside postcards.